Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's program here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have reached the 9th day of June. It is a Tuesday. It is a beautiful day here in southern West Virginia. I hope that your day is going well also. We are experiencing here in southern West Virginia some really exciting things. The flagship university in West Virginia, West Virginia University, has purchased the buildings here to open a new campus here in the Beckley area, and the incoming president of that operation delivered our Rotary program today, and we had most of the leading people from the local community there, newspaper, media. It was a very, very interesting and very positive and exciting meeting. So anyway, things are looking up in our area, and of course, if you have been following, looking what's going on in Appalachia in terms of job loss and everything else, I guess maybe it's one of those things where you can't keep going down forever. Eventually, you got to hit bottom and begin to bounce back, and maybe we are. It is a pleasure to be with you today on this Tuesday. I welcome you. I thank you for your continued support and for the Virtual Center and for the Head On Radio Network. I think one of the things that keeps coming home to me more and more and more as we do these programs is how very extremely important the voice that is reflected and represented here at the Head On Radio Network is to our political and economic social dialogue in this country. So I do encourage you to do everything that you can continue to do, everything that you can do to keep the Head On Radio Network on the air. And one of the things, and again, I know that the needs are often and usually financial. I understand that. But there's also the issue of word of mouth, and there's also the issue of spreading the word and encouraging contacts and colleagues and friends that you interact with. It doesn't have to be local. It can be on the Internet or anywhere else, because ultimately this program is available to anybody who can tune into the Internet. So if you have contacts on the other side of the country, the other side of the world, we do encourage you, because the more awareness there is of what's happening here, I think the more successful we will be. I think the more successful the entire nation will be in order to keep the dialogue going. Again, welcome. Thank you for tuning in to today's program. We have a phone number, as you know. Each day we begin our program. We usually begin at the top of each hour by sharing with you our phone number, because we do encourage you to participate in the program. We would love to hear your thoughts, your ideas, your perspectives, your concerns related to some of the issues that we're dealing with here. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. Repeat that, 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, and a number of you do on a regular basis, I would appreciate hearing from you, and I'll do the very best I can to respond. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. At the end of yesterday's program, we had, as you recall, if you were with us, we had 6 or 7 minutes left at the end of our program before we signed off yesterday, and I had spent some time giving what I anticipated would be a preview of our abbreviated program today. You know, of course, that we are beginning 1/2 hour later than we usually do, as is the practice on Tuesdays. So our program today will be 90 minutes rather than the full 2 hours. But I had given a preview, and in that preview I had mentioned what I anticipated today's program would be about. And that is the attack on truth. And it's based on an article that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education yesterday. And I mentioned that. I mentioned the article. And indeed, one of our listeners, Harry, a friend from Baltimore, was obviously on his game yesterday and sent me a couple of very, very substantive emails last night on issues and resources that he was aware of that he felt might contribute to today's program. And first of all, I want to personally thank him, but I want to encourage all of you to recognize how very, very important this is. Some of these topics and some of these issues, I believe, are extremely significant. And so whatever support or help or access to resources or ideas or anything like that you have that you feel would help us deliver better programming here at the Virtual Center, I would love to hear from you. And again, you can do it by email, you can do it on the phone, whatever. But I would love to hear from you, and I want to thank Harry for his emails and for his resources. As I mentioned in the introduction yesterday, this issue of, and I'm quoting the title of the article that was in the Chronicle, the attack on truth, it seems to me extremely important, because what it is leading to and what it is potentially causing to happen in our society, it seems to me, is extremely significant. It's a little bit frightening. Basically, when we talk about an attack on truth, we're talking about raising questions as to whether, in fact, there is truth. Whether, in fact, if there is truth, we can know it. It really raises serious questions about the ways that our society, our culture, has generally proceeded in the search for truth. It raises the question about the issues of cognitive thinking. It raises questions about reasoning. It raises serious questions about whether, in fact, the process of reasoning can lead to the truth at all. And of course, the next step from that, it seems to me, is to raise a question as to whether, in fact, there even is a truth. And increasingly, we begin to see movements in a direction which suggest that truth is whatever the person who defines it believes it is. In other words, there are a number of different truths, and we have a choice. My truth is as good as your truth. My history is as valid as your history. My facts are as legitimate as are your facts. And the more of that we confront, the more we begin to raise serious questions about whether, in fact, it's even possible to know what fact is, what truth is. It seems to me that that is potentially extremely dangerous. And that's the reason I feel that this issue is one that we needed to bring to the table here at the Virtual Center. I mentioned yesterday that this particular issue, in my experience, in my past, my career, came up in the 1980s. Principally in the form of a very, very an excellent best-selling book by Alan Bloom called The Closing of the American Mind. And the subtitle of Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, the subtitle says how higher education has failed democracy and impoverished the souls of today's students. I thought that I had mentioned that yesterday, and I had mentioned the general theme of Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. Because what Alan Bloom's book was about was to challenge the issue of relativity in the search for truth. In other words, whether in fact there was absolute truth at all, or whether truth is relative, rather whether it depends on your perspective. And Alan Bloom's concern, his mission in writing this book, it seems to me, was to raise the issue of the extent to which our young people are being educated to believe that absolute truth doesn't exist and that truth is much more relative. And this I think is extremely significant, and that how you pursue truth is the significant factor. In other words, is truth the ultimate goal, or is following accepted procedure in pursuit of truth the acceptable goal? And I think that much of this material is significant. And in the course of our program today, as we address this issue, I want to touch on some of the things that Harry brought to my attention in his wonderful emails yesterday, because I think they are very significant, and they really contribute to this entire discussion, this entire issue. Because I think it's broad, I think it's complex, and I think it's extremely important. I would love to hear from you on this, again. So I remind you once more of our phone number, which is area code 304-663-4676. If you'll permit me, I'd like to begin by sharing with you a passage from Alan Bloom's book. This is on page 25. It is his introduction. And he entitles his introduction, Our Virtue. And let me share, I'll read this rather quickly. It won't take long, but I think it kind of gives us some idea of where I think we need to go. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the student's reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the proposition as not self-evident astonishes them, as though he were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. These are things you don't think about. The students' backgrounds are as various as America can provide. Some are religious, Some are atheists, some are to the left, some to the right, some intend to be scientists, some humanists, or professionals or businessmen. Some are poor, some are rich. They are unified only in their relativism and in their allegiance to equality. And the two are related in a moral intention. The relativity of truth is not a theoretical insight, but a moral postulate, the condition of a free society, or so they see it. They have all been equipped with this framework early on, and it is in the modern replacement for the inalienable natural rights that used to be the traditional American grounds for a free society. That it is a moral issue for students is revealed by the character of their response when challenged. A combination of disbelief and indignation. Are you an absolutist? The only alternative they know, uttered in the same tone as, are you a monarchist? Or, do you really believe in witches? This latter leads into the indignation, for someone who believes in witches might well be a witch hunter or a Salem judge. The danger they have been taught to fear from absolutism is not error, but intolerance. Relativism is necessary to openness. And this is the virtue, the only virtue, which all primary education for more than 50 years has dedicated itself to inculcating. Openness. And the relativism that makes it the only plausible stance in the face of various claims to truth and various ways of life and kinds of human beings is the great insight of our times. The true believer is the real danger. The study of history and of culture teaches that all the world was mad in the past. Men always thought they were right, and that led to wars, persecutions, slavery, xenophobia, racism, and chauvinism. The point is not to correct the mistakes and really be right. Rather, it is not to think you are right at all. The students, of course, cannot defend their opinion. It is something with which they have been indoctrinated. The best they can do is point out all the opinions and cultures there are, and have been. What right, they ask, do I or anyone else have to say one is better than the others? If I pose the routine questions designed to confute them and make them think, such as, if you had been a British administrator in India, would you have let the natives under your governance burn the widow at the funeral of a man who had died? They either remain silent or reply that the British should never have been there in the first place. It's not that they know very much about other nations or about their own. The purpose of their education is not to make them scholars, but to provide them with a moral virtue, openness. That is a selection from Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. His goal in that book is to argue for truth, is to argue for absolutes, is to argue for the pursuit of truth, and is to seek respect for those who continue to pursue truth. His enemy are people that have stopped looking for truth. His enemy is those who deny that there is a truth at all. His enemy is the virtue of openness. And if I can, I'd like to take a couple of moments here just to elaborate on that a little bit in order to clarify not only Alan Bloom's position, but also my own, because I think, again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, neither do I want him to put words in mine, if that makes sense. It seems to me that, from my perspective, that the issue of process, the issue of procedure, has assumed a status which has become, in the eyes of many, equal to, if not superior to, the outcome. Many of you, I know I have heard this many times about students that have been struggling with the so-called new math. And they come home with a math problem that the instructor, the teacher, has marked wrong. And the teacher will say, I don't want you to give me the answer. I want to see your work. I want to see how you arrive at the answer. You'll even get partial credit for a wrong answer, provided you have pursued it in the proper way. And in the minds of students, that implies that process is as important, if not more important, than the outcome. Then you begin to look at things like government, like the Constitution, which is obviously the basis for this whole endeavor. And one of the things that we focus on increasingly in our Bill of Rights is the idea in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment of due process. No person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property. No person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Have you thought about that? If not, I ask you to. On a first reading, on a superficial reading, our first tendency is to support what that says because it seems to put a value on life, on freedom, and on property. But if you think about it a little bit more, you begin to realize that the value is not so much on those things as it is in the process, due process. In other words, if you follow due process, if the state follows due process, if government follows due process, if the CEO in the corporation follows due process, then life, liberty, and property cease to be absolute rights and they become commodities that can be denied when due process is followed. So that means that what initially appears to be a commitment to the sanctity of life, the value of liberty, and the sanctity of private property as well, really isn't. Rather, it is outlining what we must do in order to deny those things to citizens. So therefore, this is not a statement on the absolute sanctity of life or anything else. It kind of suggests that these rights are relative rights. They are not unalienable rights. Consequently, the state, based on these things, derives the power to incarcerate people in prisons. It assumes the right to take human life in the face of abhorrent crimes. It gives the state the right to take what people believe to be their own private property. If it's in the public interest, we call that eminent domain. In other words, I think all of these things need to be thought of. The point I'm trying to make is that there is all sorts of evidence, all sorts of indications in our past as to how important process is. So if we think about what Alan Bloom has written, we begin to appreciate the fact that the key to relativity in our society, at least as we educate our young people, is on the issue of openness. The key is not what the answer is. The key is to make sure that the process was transparent and that the answer we came to, even if it wasn't correct, was pursued properly, was done properly. And it seems to me that what Bloom is focusing on is the real philosophical issue that all of us need to deal with. And I think that's where these topics come into play in today's world. I mentioned the emails that Harry sent me. And they were excellent emails, and I'll share some of the content of those later on in today's program. But one of the controversies, and of course one of the issues, the major issues in this whole controversy is the issue of science, the scientific method. Because we have believed, going all the way back to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, we have become, as a civilization, as a culture, we have become committed to the process of pursuing truth. We have become wedded to the idea that if we follow certain accepted procedures and we do things the way they should be done, then the result will be the truth. Our entire civilization has been built upon that. We believe, we have been taught, we see all around us, that our system of law, our court systems, our judicial system, is based on the same premise. That if you guarantee an attorney to the accused, And if you choose a jury that has not prejudged the issue, then theoretically a group, 12 is a number that people frequently focus on, although it's not always 12. If you get enough people that have not prejudged the issue, and you have the best argument presented by the prosecution, by the state, and you have the best argument presented by the defense attorney on behalf of the accused, then the assumption is that 12 people who have not prejudged the issue can come together and discover truth. It's based on that same premise. That's what we believe in. Our whole system of justice is based on the premise that there is an acceptable, legitimate way to pursue truth. That cultural acceptance, that process, that system is under attack. It has been under attack for some time. On the one hand, you can look at this issue as a threat to the scientific method itself, as a threat to scientists. So consequently, if you challenge truth as it's being presented by those who are trained, who are educated as professionals in the process for pursuing truth, in other words, trained scientists, then we as a society have come to the idea that if we don't like that truth, we can just refuse to accept it. We can continue to adhere to our own truth, to our own definition, to what we believe. This raises some very serious questions. Because one of the issues that we probably have spent as much time on here at the Virtual Center over previous months and years now is the issue of education. And there's no question that the key question that keeps coming up over and over and over again as we look at the issues of education is should education be a process to teach people the methodology for pursuing truth for themselves? Or should education be the process of indoctrination that brainwashes young people into believing a definition of truth that others have found? In other words, is education a process of building patriotism and skewing the past, skewing the evidence, loading the evidence, if you will, cherry-picking the evidence, in order to bring to the table all of those things that support the particular definition of truth that the system has decided should be inculcated in our young people? And I use the word inculcated advisedly. It's a word used prominently by Benjamin Rush in his Mode of Education Proper in a Republic. And it's a beautifully effective word because it says exactly what the process is about. You are inculcating truth. You are taking your truth and delivering it to other people and not giving them the option of questioning it. Rather, the only option they have is to accept it and memorize it. And for a long time, that's been our definition of education. The idea that education is something else. The idea that individuals, all individuals, should be equipped as much as their abilities and their talents will allow them to be, so that they can begin to make decisions and pursue truth for themselves. To some people, to many people, that's frightening. We traditionally, in our society, in our history, we traditionally have wanted the assurance that before we're willing to educate people to do that, we need to know who they are. We need to know who their parents are. We need to know what their upbringing is. We need to know what their priorities are. We need to know what their life plan is. We need to know where they want to take us in their definition of truth. In other words, before we're willing to allow children, young people, to learn the formula for the pursuit of truth, I've called it the scientific method. That's one aspect of it. We'll get to others, later on. We want to know who they are. We want to be sure that they're safe. We want to know that they don't have an agenda that we don't know about. We want to know that their goal is not to sabotage our society or to challenge our way of life. We want to be sure that we know what they believe before we're willing to give them the keys that will open their mind. And when a reform movement comes along that promises to do that, many people recoil. Many people become extremely frightened and extremely upset. And they're unwilling to do it. But on the other hand, they can't say that they're opposed to education. They can't say that they're opposed to learning. They can't say that they're opposed to the search for truth. So what they have to do is challenge the reform in ways that don't blow their cover, that don't tell us clearly who they are and what they're about. So what do? They question the integrity of the people who came up with the reform. They question the motives of the people who initiated the reforms. They question the people and the groups and the organizations that support the reforms. And of course, many of you are thinking he's talking about Common Core. Yeah, but that's not the only one I'm talking about. But yeah, for purposes of today's world, yes. If you look at the challenges and the opposition to the Common Core, you begin to see that nobody takes on the standards. Nobody takes on the substance. what they do is they question who came up with them. They question why they came up with them. They question why is the federal government so strongly behind them. They question corporations and organizations that advocate the Common Core standards. What's their agenda? What are they going to get out of this? They question, they're very skeptical of the big money that seems to be behind the Common Core or other reforms, educational reforms in our history. Basically, what they can't say, what they won't say, is that their major concern is they aren't comfortable that the young people that would be educated in this way can handle it. Not that it's going to tax their abilities, tax their minds, cause stress, cause them to have anxiety disorder, cause them to commit suicide or any of the other things that might happen. No, that's not what they worry. They're not worried about the welfare of the individual students who can't handle this kind of cognitive emphasis in education. Their primary concern is when these young people encounter things that they've always been told are true that they now learn are not. Their fear is that too many young people will not be able to handle the truth. Because what they're going to discover very quickly is that many of the things they've been told were true are not. And in fact, many of the things they've been told were true are part of an agenda by others who didn't have their best interests in mind. That's the fear. And I think that they are really, many people are really concerned about that. But they can't say it. So the whole discussion and debate over Common Core, and again, I'm using that as an example because that's the particular reform that's out there right now. The whole debate about the Common Core in terms of pros and cons is specious. It's artificial. It's not real. Because it doesn't get to the heart of what the real issues are. And it doesn't matter, and this is where this whole topic, I think, comes home to roost. This is where all of this becomes really significant. It puts those who have developed and devised, created the reform on the defensive, on their heels, because they feel that they need to defend the process against the charges of the opponents. And how do they do that? By coming up with evidence. By presenting the facts, by presenting the details of how they came into being, what prompted them in the first place, why is corporate America so strongly behind them, what's the federal government's role in this, is this really a takeover of the young people of the nation by the federal government, is this an effort to blunt local control and the tradition of community schools and community education in America. All of these things. The way you challenge or come up against or refute, try to refute the attacks is to present evidence. But how do you do that when the people who are behind the attacks refuse to accept the evidence as evidence. They refuse to accept the fact that there really are facts. What makes this whole topic, it seems to me, significant and worthy of serious attention, and I may be way out of my element in taking this on, because this really can take us in directions which are, it seems to me, pretty difficult. But this is the real, I think, threat of all of this. Because the more the attack on truth becomes acceptable, the more it begins to cause people to question the existence of truth itself. The more it gets them to fall back into the fallback position of one person's truth is another person's lie, or something like that. Or my truth is as good as your truth. Or I don't care what kind of evidence you've got, I refuse to budge from what I believe to be true right now. And the only evidence that I care to see is evidence that's going to reinforce what I believe, not challenge it. And so suddenly all the accepted procedures for pursuing truth and finding truth that our civilization has accepted for hundreds of years are being called into question. And here, it seems to me, is the final point that I would make on this. All of this is happening in the face of young people who really don't know and aren't sure what to believe. And so to them, their conclusion is, hell, all I got to do is worry about me. I got to find a way to get through this, get out of this. How many times we're in, here we are early in June, we're in the season of high school and college graduations. How many evidences have you seen at commencement exercises of young people saying, oh, thank God, finally school's over, now I can begin my life? As if some dramatic 90-degree shift, change, is going to happen. And suddenly, what they got in the diploma is a certificate that it's okay for them now to begin living. The implication that the years they were in school was the price they had to pay for the freedom to live. When in fact, the years that they were in school was really the period that was going to determine how they live. As a historian, in thinking about all of this stuff, I can't help go back to the transition in Europe from the medieval to the modern period. And we've covered this before numerous times. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it. Specifically, the role of the Catholic Church in the medieval period. And the generally accepted belief demanded by the church that truth was what the church called truth. God so loved mankind that he created the church. It was to be his rock. Peter the Rock was to be its first pope. And in order to avoid controversy, disagreement, disputes, the church's thinking was that there needs to be only one definition of truth, and we will provide it. And that is what God meant when God created the church. He created the church to help men save their souls. The formula was to follow the teachings of the church, and salvation was guaranteed. The evidence, all you had to do was look up in the sky. The evidence was the sun, rising in the morning, setting in the evening. The sun was the moon, rising in the evening, setting in the morning. The proof was the planets revolving around the earth. The earth was the center of God's universe. It made sense that it would be the center of God's universe because God's greatest creation, man himself, lived upon this planet. It made perfect sense then that it was the center of the universe and everything else revolved around it. Along came Copernicus, and after him Galileo. And through the powers of observation and experiment, they discovered a definition of truth that was different from the church's truth. How did the church respond? By threatening excommunication and death to Galileo if he didn't recant. And insisting in the continued adherence to its definition of truth. Because once there's a crack in the wall, once the church acknowledges or admits that one of the truths that it taught was not true at all, then what's to prevent people from thinking that other things the church is asserting as truth are not true either? Therefore, the church feels that it has no choice but to dig in its heels, to assert itself, to reject the evidence which suggests that the church's definition of truth is not real, and persecute those who refuse to accept that. Plato, in the allegory of the cave, in the Republic, when one person of all of those who have been chained in the cave for their entire lives and have grown up believing that the shadows playing out on the wall before them was the truth. When one person is unchained and is allowed to turn around and see the light coming into the cave and realize that it's the light coming into the cave that is creating the shadows on the wall ahead of them, and the immediate realization from that everything we thought was true isn't, Everything we thought was real isn't. And then you go out into the sunlight and you are allowed, after your eyes adjust to the brightness of the sun, after being in the cave throughout your entire life, you are gradually able to look up and to focus on the world, on reality. And you begin to realize that you know reality that none of the people that you grew up with know. You know things that they don't know. And Plato raises the question, how do you tell them? You've got to tell them. If you know the truth and they don't, you've got to tell them. Plato points out that when you go in and you tell them that everything that they believed is true for their whole lives is not true, that everything they've believed, was taught was true, isn't, they will kill you rather than allow you to disrupt the entire worldview, the entire universe that they have created for themselves. Their world is comfortable. Their world is innocent. Their world is complete. They don't have any questions. Everything they need to know is paint is portrayed on that wall, in the shadows on that wall. And here you come, questioning everything that they've always believed, everything that they've always cherished. Every value that they've ever had, you question. And you challenge. They are not going to accept that. It seems to me that Plato's allegory of the cave is a fabulous metaphor for teaching, because it raises some of the substantive questions that it seems to me every teacher, every instructor at one point or another in their lives has had to confront. So that's why I think this is so incredibly significant. Because not only will the people in the cave turn on you, but substantively they will reject your evidence. They will deny the reality that you bring. They will deny the facts. Because to them everything makes sense. If they even show a glimpse of accepting the truth that you bring, then their whole world falls into a heap. Their whole world crumbles. Because everything that was accepted as part of their world, all of which fits, now suddenly nothing fits. Consequently, they've got to reject what you say. They've got to reject the evidence. The role of the educator, says Plato, is to go back into that cave and bring truth to those who do not have it. That's the responsibility of the educated. That's what education is about. Understanding that education is the pursuit of truth, and that in order to pursue truth, you need to proceed in acceptable ways, not only leads us to the scientific revolution as far as natural scientists are concerned, but it also leads to the kinds of cognitive skills that it seems to me are associated with the bringing of educational quality to everybody. And I think we can see the attacks on the Common Core as evidence of the behavior of people, I was going to say, who have spent their lives in a cave. But that's not true. Many of the people who are opposed to the Common Core oppose it because they understand the implications of what it might cause to happen. And it's those implications that they want to prevent. So they aren't one of the people living in the cave watching the shadows. Their job is to make sure that you as a student stay in that cave and continue to accept truth as we're feeding it to you. This is really what this attack on truth is all about. It's not, in my view, and again, this is just my view, and I know Harry expressed to me concerns because he sees this in many ways as a challenge, as an attack on scientists and on the scientific method. It seems to me that from where I stand, I think the scientists are going to be okay. They'll weather the storm, so to speak. Those I worry about are the people who depend on this kind of leadership and this kind of knowledge, this kind of generation of new knowledge, and have faith in it, and have to trust in it. What's happening when you shake that faith? When you create a mindset in more and more people that there's no way to know what's true and what isn't. I think we're seeing this more and more all the time. The data on the numbers of people who have stopped affiliating with institutionalized or denominational religion, people who have stopped going to church, people that have stopped identifying themselves as member of a particular denomination or a particular faith, people who have stopped identifying themselves as a member of a particular party or a particular group. A lot of this is uncertainty, it seems to me. And it's an uncertainty being generated by this attack on truth. I honestly do not believe, and maybe this is my own naivete, I may be naive as hell in all of this, but I like to believe that many of the people who are involved in this really don't understand the implications of what they're doing. I don't think they really understand the long-term implications of what they're doing. I think their goals are short. In other words, they think that the end of the game, victory, would be the demise of the Common Core. I would suggest to you that there's much more that's going to change as a result of this than that. I think the outcomes go way beyond the program or the reform itself. I'm right now picking up a copy of the article that was in the Chronicle yesterday entitled The Attack on Truth by Lee McIntyre. Let me share a couple of, I think, relevant passages from this article, and we can pursue it. I really didn't think yesterday at the end of our program when I talked about dealing with this topic today, I really didn't think that this was a topic that would go more than one program. But I'm beginning to see, as I look at the time, I'm beginning to see that I was wrong. We are already at 2:35 p.m. in the East. We only have less than 25 minutes left in our program. There's no way that we can really deal with this topic in the 25 minutes left to us in today's program. So probably we will, not probably, undoubtedly, we will be continuing this topic tomorrow. Lee McIntyre, in one of the first paragraphs in the article, makes this comment. I think this is a pretty important paragraph. Humans have always held some wrong-headed beliefs that were later subject to correction by reason and evidence. But we have reached a watershed moment when the enterprise of basing our beliefs on fact rather than intuition is truly in peril. Traditionally, we have believed our system of reason, our Enlightenment tradition of reason. John Locke, for example, believed that individuals who really applied common sense, logic, reason to their situation in the state of nature would all come to the same conclusion. They would realize that there's got to be a better way, that if we create government to establish order and enforce the law of nature, as it were, enforce order, all of us will be freer. None of us will have to spend so much of our time protecting ourselves against each other. We can turn to allow the government to do that. So that was the basis of the idea of limited government in John Locke. It's all based on this idea of reason. That man's reason and common sense, man's mind, will lead him to the truth. It's a faith. It's a faith that our entire civilization is built upon. And it is a faith that is under attack. That faith tells us that when challenged, what we need to do to confront the challenge is compile the evidence, is assemble the facts. But how do you do that when the person doing the challenging refuses to accept the fact? Rather insists on continuing to believe what he or she believes in spite of the facts you bring to the table. How many times have we seen evidences of people who say, hey, those are your facts, I'll get my own facts. For every fact that you bring to the table that suggests that I'm wrong, I'll bring two facts which prove that I'm right. Within the Western tradition, within the Enlightenment tradition of Western civilization, within the parameters of the idea of assembling evidence and drawing your conclusions based on what the evidence tells you, how do you challenge? How do you confront that kind of a challenge to your definition of truth? If the scientists all over the world are bringing evidence to the table which indicates that the climate is warming at a rate that poses serious problems for mankind, and you refuse to accept it, you refuse to accept that evidence, what's my next move? But not only, and this is, I think, what we're dealing with in today's world, not only do you refuse to accept that evidence, But you begin to use whatever communication mechanisms are available to you to reassert your definition of truth. In other words, you're not content with denying my evidence to me. You are inclined to attack my evidence before the world, and thereby bring together other people who believe what you believe. And suddenly, it's your truth versus my truth. I've got evidence that our civilization has generally accepted is legitimate. You don't. But you refuse to accept that. So what we're talking about here is what Lee McIntyre, the author of this article, refers to as willful ignorance. It's much more than simple ignorance. Simple ignorance is not knowing. Willful ignorance is not knowing and not wanting to know. And I would suggest that willful ignorance runs counter to everything this civilization has ever believed in. It runs counter to every reform, every mechanism of progress that Western civilization has experienced in the modern age. And by modern age, I don't just mean 21st century. I mean since the medieval period, since the scientific revolution. Basically, willful ignorance usually is associated with obstinacy. Not only do you reject my evidence, but you dig in your heels and absolutely, obstinately refuse to acknowledge its legitimacy. Not only that, but you outwardly and visibly demonstrate contempt for the methods, the methodology that currently leads us to the recognition of truth. In other words, you don't only reject my truth, you reject the entire procedure that I use to get to it. You reject the civilization, you reject the culture. So obstinate are you in your belief system. Basically, it seems to me it becomes, as much as anything else, a total disrespect for the truth. It's a disrespect for evidence. It's a disrespect for process. And it's a disrespect for the sincerity and the skills of those people who generate the evidence. But I suggest to you that in today's world, it's very difficult to challenge this kind of obstinacy because you have access to the resources which give you the means to scream louder and more often than I do. Because everybody who has a vested interest in believing what you believe is going to come to the forefront and support you and your evidence to downgrade, disrespect, and belittle my evidence. Lee McIntyre says this at the end of his article. I'm going to say it right now because I'm not nearly I don't think what he says in this article is we've nearly covered. But Lee McIntyre points out that in the context of this particular issue, of this particular conflict or controversy, the internet is a major villain because the internet makes it possible to perpetuate untruth. The internet makes it possible to scream before the world, to insist on your definition of truth over any other. The internet does not contain a mechanism that makes it possible to censor or screen what's available out there. Untruth, out and out lie, continues to exist because the internet does not provide us a way to eliminate it. There's no censor. There's no control. And to be honest with you, most of us, and I include myself in this group, most of us don't want such a mechanism. Don't want the internet censored. We want access to all that's out there. But this presumes intelligent people who are able to weigh evidence and to recognize fraudulent procedure and fraudulent conclusions. And that requires education. In the face or in light of our commitment to freedom, our commitment to access to information, our commitment to the marketplace of ideas, it seems to me that we begin the decline on a slippery slope if we begin deleting stuff from the internet because we believe it to be false. I would suggest to you we're moving into the area of totalitarianism there. We are moving into the realm of the Nazi Germanys and the Stalinist Soviet Union and the Maoist China. And I'm struck by the Cultural Revolution of Mao in China, when literally Mao set out to abolish China's past in order that he could create a new one. We don't want to do that. But the only alternative to doing that, I would suggest, is to educate people well enough that people are able to spot fraud for themselves and spot obstinacy and narrowness and self-interest. In order to do that, they have to be able to recognize an agenda. They have to be able to pursue evidence. They have to be able to evaluate evidence. They have to be able to separate good evidence from not good evidence. They need to be able to put it together and make a case. But all of it needs to be consistent with the accepted ideas or formula for the definition of truth in our civilization. I think one of the strongest features of McIntyre's piece, and we'll get back to it tomorrow. I've got an awful lot. I apologize to Harry because I didn't get to his stuff today, but I will tomorrow. McIntyre, the author of this piece, addresses Plato's dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro, Euthyphro, Euthyphro. It's an absolutely astounding dialogue. And I'm summarizing it right. I'm summarizing it as Lee McIntyre summarizes it here. In this particular dialogue, Socrates, who is facing trial for impiety and corrupting youth, admonishes a callow young fellow for professing to know what righteousness is. Socrates demonstrates again and again in this particular dialogue that Euthyphro has no idea what he's talking about when he argues that it would be righteous for him to prosecute his own father for murder on the basis of some pretty shoddy evidence. The story is that Euthyphro's father is a king. And he's responsible for the death of a slave. And the reason for this death is that he arrested the slave for violation of the law. But he did not protect the welfare of the slave until the final trial could take place. He bound the slave and left him out in the elements, and the slave died. And Euthyphro felt that his father could legitimately be accused and convicted of this crime, manslaughter. Socrates questions Euthyphro on his definition of righteousness. And of course, Socrates' whole point is, what makes you think that you are so righteous, that you have the right to judge? And he begins to ask the kind of uncomfortable, humiliating questions that force Euthyphro to pretty much back down. But MacIntyre points out that Socrates never claims to have the truth for himself. But he does claim that the process of questioning and answering that he's putting Euthyphro through will lead Euthyphro to the truth. At the end of the dialogue, Euthyphro walks away. When he can't win, he leaves. He takes his ball and goes home. According to MacIntyre, and this is his interpretation, it's pretty much mine as well, what Plato is telling us here in this particular dialogue, Euthyphro, is what MacIntyre calls a central lesson about the philosopher's search for knowledge. The real enemy, MacIntyre says, is not ignorance, doubt, or even disbelief. It's false knowledge. When we profess to know something, even in the face of absent or contradictory evidence, that's when we stop looking for the truth. When we begin to reject the facts because they don't support what we want to believe, and we reject them, that's when we're off the track in the pursuit of truth. And MacIntyre says the following, and I think it's very well put together. If we're ignorant, perhaps we'll be motivated to learn. If we're skeptical, we can continue to search for answers. If we disbelieve, maybe others can convince us. And perhaps even if we're honestly wrong and put forth a proposition that's open to refutation, we can learn something when our earlier belief is shown to be fallacious. But when we choose to insulate ourselves from new ideas or evidence because we think that we already know what's true, that's when we're most likely to believe falsehoods, false knowledge. It's not merely disbelief that explains why truth is so often respected. It's one's attitude. Basically, if the evidence does not support what you believe, then our culture teaches that you need to readjust or reflect upon and reconfigure your beliefs. Because the evidence is the evidence. But when you reject the evidence, you are rejecting, in the name of adhering to your own beliefs, you are rejecting what our culture teaches us is the way to pursue truth. You're not only rejecting facts, you're rejecting the procedure or the process that led to those facts. And if you are successful in continuing to assert that you are right and I am wrong, then you are going to convince other people who don't know any better that there's no such thing as truth. And that you're perfectly able or right, have a perfect right to believe whatever you want to believe. I would suggest that that may be where we are or where we're headed in today's world. And I think we can see it in our schools. I think we can see it in our young people. If you get them, it seems to me if you ask young people in a private moment and assure them they won't get in trouble for being honest, what they think about the world we've left them, they would say, God, what a mess. You guys don't even know which end is up. Isn't that frightening? I think it is. What we haven't dealt with yet, and we've only got 2 minutes, less than 2 minutes left in our program. What we haven't yet even begun to address are the belief systems that cause people to reject fact, to reject evidence, to disrespect truth. And that's where Harry's wonderful emails will come into play during tomorrow's program. Because what we find is that there are people and interests out there who have a vested interest, a financial interest, in some cases, in rejecting the evidence. And because of their influence and because of their power, they are able to raise serious questions in the public's mind about the evidence itself and about the objectivity of the people who gather that evidence. Literally, they are questioning the validity of the scientific method. Literally, they are questioning the validity of human reason. They are questioning the possibility that man's reason can lead him to truth. I would suggest to you that when people believe that, they leave themselves totally exposed, totally vulnerable to the inculcation of somebody else's truth. And I would suggest to you we don't want to go there. It's 59 minutes after the hour, and we've reached the end of our program today. You've been listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and we'll be back tomorrow at our regular time, 1 p.m. in the East, 1/2 hour earlier than today. I want to thank you for tuning in. I invite you to give us a call tomorrow and react to some of this stuff, because I think it's pretty revocative and pretty confrontational in some cases. But in any case, enjoy your evening, be safe, because we really do want you back here for tomorrow's program. Thank you so very much. Good day.